external affairs, but whose relations with foreign countries were controlled from London. There was the Indian Empire, which was a collection of princely states and regions ruled directly by Britain. There were crown colonies such as Hong Kong and Singapore. There were dependencies such as the African colonies, which had British governors who ruled large native populations. There was no single system for governing the empire.
What about imperial defense?
That was another big problem, and it was the biggest one in the eyes of the Round Table. They argued that the Dominions, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand had no say in the foreign policies of the British Empire. All political problems, large and small, were handled by the British Parliament in London. That included local business as well, which meant that Parliament didn't have enough time to spend on issues affecting the whole empire. But what especially bothered the Round Table was that the Dominions had no say, no representation, if you will, in matters of war and peace.
What was the Round Table solution for this?
They felt that another parliament should be created to which representatives from the Dominions would be elected. The British Parliament would continue, but it would handle local British affairs, much as the Australian Parliament would handle Australian domestic issues. The Imperial Parliament would concern itself with foreign policy and general imperial policy, such as free trade and tariffs.
That never came to pass, of course.
Obviously not. In fact, the Round Table movement was effectively defeated in 1911 when the Imperial Conference of that year rejected federal proposals put forward by Sir Joseph Ward, the New Zealand Prime Minister.
So in your view, the Round Table's fundamental objective was the federation of the British Empire, and nothing else?
Yes, that is my argument.
That creates quite a puzzle for me. The Round Table was actively involved in many other things, but
those activities were not on behalf of the Round Table. In other words, if they did not advance the cause of imperial union, then they were not what I would consider Round Table activities.
Then why is the Round Table still around even today? You say that their plans were undone as early as 1911, and yet almost a century later the group still exists.
It's quite remarkable, I admit. The answer, I think, is that the Round Table was really a group of close friends and colleagues. And like any group of friends, the tendency is to stay together instead of falling apart.
But why continue with the organization and the journal? If it was just wasted energy and money, why not pack up the Round Table and just stay friends?
I think they saw that they could still do good for the empire by publishing information for policymakers and by making their own viewpoints known. They had also developed a very large network of contacts around the empire that it would have been wasteful to abandon.
Let's go back to Professor Quigley and your counter-thesis. There are two things that you object to in your book: that the Round Table had close ties to Lord Milner, and that the Round Table was an influential organization.
Well, I do make a mention of some instances where they were influential, such as the Irish settlement in 1921 and the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in India in 1919. But please go ahead.
In your treatment of Milner, I got the impression that you wanted to downplay his role in the Round Table. Is that an accurate impression?
I would prefer to call it clarifying his role. But yes, I did try to keep from exaggerating his role like Professor Quigley did.
And yet, he was the Round Table's father figure, and he supplied a great deal of the funding that was needed to start the journal.
Yes, he had an inspirational role to play, and his involvement in the Rhodes Trust did give him access to money that was used by the Round Table. But he was a very busy man, especially when he entered the Lloyd George cabinet in World War I, so he gave it his time only when he was able.
You mention in your book that after he retired from government service in 1921, he attended Round Table meetings when he could. Those are your words.
Yes, that's what I wrote.
How often would that have been? It sounds like he didn't attend all of the meetings, but you're not specific about how many he did attend.
It's hard to say without access to my original research.
Yes, of course. However, when I looked at Professor Nimick's book about the kindergarten, he was very specific. He says that after Milner's resignation, Milner attended every Round Table meeting, held until his death in 1925.
I have no reason for doubting Professor Nimick about that. But I'm not sure what your point is.
Doesn't it seem as if you were trying to downplay the extent of Milner's involvement with the Round Table? You could have said he went to every meeting, but you worded it so that it seemed as if Milner went only when he could, which could have been only a few times. If he went to every meeting, doesn't that suggest he had a strong interest and commitment to the Round Table?
Yes, but my intent was not to misrepresent Milner's ties with the Round Table. I was more interested in showing that the movement was not part of some nexus of influence controlled by Milner, as Professor Quigley had claimed.
And yet, the fact that Milner did attend every meeting from 1921 to 1925 supports Professor Quigley's argument that he and the Round Table worked closely together.
It's a minor piece of evidence in the big picture. I'm sorry, but it just is.
Let's go into your other area of disagreement with Professor Quigley, the question of Round Table influence. In your book, I had a strong feeling that you wanted, again, to downplay the influence of the Round Table. Or do you prefer the word clarify?
Clarification would be a better word.
All right, clarification.
Let's be frank. For as long as the Round Table has been around, people have made wild claims about how powerful and secretive it is. They're the same sort of wild claims that people used to make about Freemasonry, or Jewish bankers, or what have you. You can say the Round Table was secretive, although I prefer the word private, but its power and influence were vastly overstated by men like Carroll Quigley.
Quigley brought up the issue of the Round Table having had a hand in such groups as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Institute of Pacific Relations. Are you saying the Round Table wasn't associated with these groups?
No, of course Round Table members were associated with them, but not as Round Table members per se.
What is the difference?
As I said earlier, the Round Table's purpose was to promote the development of imperial union for the British Empire. The other groups you mentioned,
the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and the Institute of Pacific Relations.
Yes, none of those groups promoted imperial federation. Therefore it is absurd to suggest that the Round Table used or controlled them for some nefarious purpose.
But what you say is true, only if imperial federation was the Round Table's only objective.
That's what the historical evidence suggests.
If imperial federation wasn't really the Round Table's only objective, wouldn't that change the picture?
It might, I suppose, but
you yourself said in your book that you would have had a somewhat different evaluation of Round Table influence if the appeasement policies of the 1930s are taken into account. What on earth does appeasing Nazi Germany have to do with federating the British Empire?
Nothing, of course.
Well, was not the Round Table concerned about anything else besides imperial federation? They must have been using their journal, their access to money, and their worldwide contacts to promote something, some point of view.
You make a good point. Yes, they did have other related interests. For example, Philip Carr and Lionel Curtis were quite interested in promoting closer Anglo-American relations.
Before we go into that, we need to take a break, and then we'll be back with Dr. John Kendle.